I couldn't believe at first I hadn't been fired. Miss Lambert couldn't quite believe it either when I came back downstairs and sat at my table. "Well, I don't get it," she said, standing over me. "Guess he likes you, huh?" I nodded. She nodded too. "Okay, well, I get how it is, and you might have Mr. Drew's trust, but it's going to take some time to earn mine," she said, clapping her hands together. I nodded again. "Right," she said. "Check in with Story and see if they have the new script." I was up on my feet in a flash, ready to show that Mr. Drew's faith in me wasn't misplaced, ready to show Miss Lambert that I wasn't someone she should be worried about. "Got it," I said. I immediately made for the elevator. "Buddy," she called out after me. "Yeah?" "You keep working on Cowboy Bendy," she said. "It better be worth all this." Her expression was as severe as ever, and yet finally I was getting my first art assignment. I was terrified at making it good since I couldn't even really make it in the first place, but I was so excited not to be fired and to get to draw that I couldn't help but grin wide. "Yes, ma'am." The rest of the day was spent doing gopher duties, which I didn't really mind because I couldn't actually work on Cowboy Bendy. I was thrilled that I was finally going to get the chance to draw, to do more than just run around like this, but at the same time, I couldn't do what my grandfather did, and wouldn't people notice the difference in ability if I started drawing my own stuff?
"So you're in a bit of a pickle,"
said Dot after I'd explained it all. She took a sip of root beer and leaned back in her seat. I hadn't wanted to admit any of it to her, but she'd heard about my almost firing and had demanded we go to the pub together again so she could pass me her Cowboy Bendy script and hear the whole story. Which I told her. I couldn't seem to keep stuff from her. "Yeah," I said. "I need to practice, but I don't think I can get good overnight." The door behind us swung open and I glanced up to see Jacob, Richie, and a couple guys from accounting come into the bar. I hunched my shoulders a bit. I didn't really want to be seen by them. I didn't know why. Maybe I was a little intimidated. They disappeared into the crowd by the bar and I looked up at Dot.
"So I've been looking into this Tom fellow," she said.
"Oh, I'd forgotten I'd asked her about that."
"Yeah, so it's very interesting. He works for a company called Gent. Seems pretty high up in the company. It looks like he's working directly with Mr. Drew on some kind of machine."
"With Mr. Drew?"
"I don't know what it is. Couldn't figure out where it even is, but I'm going to keep looking for it."
"What kind of machine?" Dot shrugged and sipped her drink.
"Maybe a more efficient way of filming cartoons?"
I nodded. "Maybe."
Look at you two so cozy.
Jacob was suddenly sitting next to me, slamming his beer down so the foam slipped over the edge and splashed onto the table. Dot rolled her eyes.
"In this heat, I wouldn't want to be getting cozy with anyone. No offense, buddy."
Ain't that the truth?
Replied Jacob, taking off his hat and mopping the sweat on his brow with a paisley handkerchief.
"So, buddy," he asked, "how are you liking working at the studio?"
"It's been interesting," I replied.
"Well, I'll say it. I'm glad you weren't fired. And I'm glad you drew that picture, because sometimes it's hard to get noticed. Trust me, I know. People will underestimate you at every turn, Mac."
He looked at Dot.
"Right?"
"Absolutely,"
she nodded.
"If anyone knows what it's like to be ignored, it's the woman and the black man. Trust us on this one."
He raised his glass to Dot and she clinked hers with his. It was as playful as I ever saw her get, but it wasn't actually playful in a way.
"You have a girl, buddy?"
Jacob asked after taking a swig. "Nah," I replied.
"Really? A good-looking kid like you?"
"I'm not too focused on that stuff right now," I said. The fact was I wasn't focused on that stuff at all. Sure, there'd been a few girls in the neighborhood I'd been sweet on, but I didn't have the time to ask them on a date. Didn't have the money to either. And now with this new job and everything. Besides, it felt really uncomfortable talking about this with work people. With any people.
"You can focus on more than one thing at once, you know,"
said Jacob. "I know. I just need to get some stuff in order. And I live at home with my ma, and my grandfather shares my bed, and I need to become a pro artist overnight."
"How's your dating life then?"
he asked, turning to Dot. She didn't say anything, just looked at her drink.
"You look sad there, Ruby Slippers. Did I say something wrong?"
She laughed a little at that and looked at him.
Don't call me that. And no, it's just, I don't date. I'm not ready.
Ready, I said. Dot sighed hard.
You too, boys, pushing, always asking questions. Don't like to answer them, but you love asking them.
I'm sorry, I said. At this point, the whole conversation had got away from me. I didn't really know what I was doing or supposed to say.
Come on, Dot, said Jacob, nudging her with his elbow.
I said no, Jacob,
she said firmly, staring him down.
Okay, I know when I'm not wanted.
He stood, picking up his beer, and took a swig.
See you two in the funny pages.
He shook his head like we were both nuts, and then he slipped into the crowd back toward the table with the other guys. Dot looked at me for a moment, then leaned her elbows on the table and hunched over a bit.
I don't like talking about that stuff.
I don't blame you, I replied. She took another pause, then a sip of soda. She looked back at me.
My husband died in the war,
she said matter-of-factly. You were married? I asked. I knew that wasn't the point. I also knew I shouldn't have been that surprised. Many of the girls in my neighborhood, the ones I'd grown up with, had already settled down and were keeping house. But there was something about Dot that just seemed like, well, not them.
Not for long. We were sweethearts in high school. Then he turned 18. They conscripted him. We married at the courthouse just before he had to leave.
She swirled around the remains of her soda in the bottom of her glass slowly.
A month later, he was dead. A month after that, the war was over.
I didn't know what to say. I didn't know why she was sharing this with me, especially after everything she'd said about boys pushing too much. My pa died in the war, early on, in 42. It was all I could think about saying, even if I didn't want to think about it in the first place. She looked up at me, then gave me a sad smile.
I'm sorry, buddy.
I'm sorry for you too. Do you want to...
Nah, I don't want to talk about it right now.
I felt really awkward. I didn't know how to carry on with a conversation like things were normal. I didn't know if Dot wanted me to. I didn't know anything. How did someone just change a subject like this? Did you just change it? So what do you think I should do? I asked, giving it a shot. Dot looked at me for a moment, then...
You mean about Cowboy Bendy?
I nodded, relieved we were on the same page. Relieved it had worked.
I think you just need to practice. I think you should also ask your grandfather if he can teach you.
I can't do that, I said, shaking my head and finishing my Coke with a gulp.
Why not?
He barely speaks English.
What does he speak?
Polish. Dot thought about that.
I don't know if you have to speak the same language. I mean, it would be different if this was about writing, but art? It's universal. Couldn't he just, show you?
I shrugged. I didn't know. Maybe he could. But that wasn't the biggest problem. The biggest problem was that he was there at all. That he creeped me out, took up my space, that my ma hadn't even told me he was coming, that we had one more mouth to feed, that I resented him. It was hard asking favors of someone like that, but maybe she was right. Maybe it didn't matter how I felt about him. Stick to your vision. Be ambitious. Dreams come to life. Do what you have to do. I'll think about it. He just got to the States and he's all confused. He might not be able to help me, even if I asked.
You're Jewish, right, buddy?
Asked Dot. I felt that very familiar tightness in my gut, that protective shield unfurl over my spine. I sat up a little straighter, but tried to sound even more casual. Yeah, is that a problem? I didn't sound casual. I sounded angry, and I knew it.
Of course not, said Dot. It's just, you said your grandfather was from Poland.
We're Polish, I snapped back. Obviously we were. Dot held up her hands.
Never mind, sorry. I don't want to get personal.
Well, I already told you my dad died and that I'm Jewish, but yeah, let's not get that personal. I couldn't not feel angry. I just knew she was judging me. I knew it. Like the bullies in the schoolyard when I was a kid. Like those same bullies all grown up calling me names as I walked through their neighborhood. I hated it. Dot shook her head.
I get it. I'm sorry.
She pushed her glass away from her across the table.
I'm going to go now.
She stood up then, just like that, and then turned and was gone. I felt bad. The defensiveness vanished and I was up on my feet chasing after her outside. She was already halfway down the block, walking that fast way she did. I caught up finally and grabbed her shoulder. She whipped around and gave me a look of death.
Oh,
she said, her expression softening.
It's you.
Look, I didn't mean to make you upset, I said.
I know.
I looked at her. She looked at me. Are you still angry with me? I asked.
I'm not angry at all. I feel bad. I upset you. I thought I should leave. Besides, it's getting late.
She looked at me like I was the one who was doing something strange. Oh, I just thought you'd stormed out.
No.
No. Okay then. I said goodnight and she said the same, and that was the first time I learned about her directness. Your directness. You once said to me that you liked writing subtext in your scripts, but had no time for subtext in real life. I always remembered that. So just in case I haven't been clear yet, Dot, and following your always amazing lead, I'll just say it plain. You have to save them. You have to stop him. It was the weekend. Not that that mattered much to Ma. She was sitting by the window at her sewing machine next to the kitchen table, putting together a suit jacket for Mr. Schwartz. I had to admit, I was still getting used to the idea of taking the weekend off myself. I'd spent the last couple weeks doing chores for Ma instead, getting the groceries, paying the milkman, that sort of thing. I was thinking about what Dot had said when my grandfather passed by with his worn jacket and hat on. Where are you going? I asked. He looked at me in that way he did. Where's he going? I asked Ma. She didn't look up from her work. Probably the library. I turned back and Grandpa had already opened the door. I just had this it's now or never feeling. Hey, Grandpa, I'll come with you. Ma did look up at that. She gave me a smile, and it was small, but so full. It was a thank you. I didn't get it, but she appreciated it. I didn't bother putting on my button-up if we were going to the library. That was just up the block, and everyone else would be in their undershirts too. It was too hot to care. I slipped on my shoes and held the door for him. He stared at me a little as he walked onto the landing, then nodded. As we stepped out into the thick midday air under a hot midday sun, I still wasn't really sure if I wanted to ask him for help. Obviously, my gut thought it was a good idea, and Dot did say to trust your gut. But at the same time, how would it even be possible for him to help me? I reminded myself he had offered to teach, that maybe I should respect that, but still. We crossed the street to avoid the open fire hydrant spraying water on the local kids, and I never thought I would be one of those people to cross the street to avoid that. I guess that meant I was getting older. Fun, he said, pointing at the kids squealing and laughing in the water. The library was a 4-story brick building on the corner. A mom and her little girl were sitting on the steps leading up to it reading a book of nursery rhymes. The girl waved at me as I walked by, and I waved back. Inside, the air was a little cooler thanks to fans in the ceiling that rotated slowly above us, and the tall white walls made of stone. It was a nice relief. The quiet was also soothing. You couldn't even hear the hum of the city. It was like when Ma would turn off the radio when it was time to go to bed. I followed my grandfather to the back of the stacks. He seemed to have a purpose. We made it to the children's section, and that's where he stopped to look through the collection. He carefully examined each book as he pulled it off the shelf, flipped open the cover, and went through the pages, then carefully and neatly put it back where he found it. It was a time-consuming process, but it was fascinating to watch. He eventually collected a small pile of books, 3 picture books, including a Curious George book, and P.B. Longstocking. It was when he looked at me and nodded, satisfied with his collection, that what he was doing finally clicked. He was teaching himself English. Of course, if he could teach himself something so difficult, then I shouldn't be afraid to ask him. That's at least how my train of thought went. Grandpa? I whispered as we made our way to the librarian's desk. He glanced in my direction. Could you teach me how to draw better? He stopped walking and looked at me. "You know," I said, motioning with my hand, pretending I was drawing on a piece of paper. "Art." He smiled. "Art?" "Yes, could you help me?" I asked. He didn't nod or say anything. He just placed the books on the checkout desk and said to the librarian behind it, "Keep for me?" She nodded. "Certainly, Mr. Unger." She knew him. Of course she did. "Come," he said to me, and I followed him. This time he made his way to the stairs, and we climbed them very slowly. We climbed to the second floor, and we walked along the stacks and then stopped. We were in the art section. I should have known. Once again, my grandfather carefully appraised the books, in no rush. He smiled at them and touched them as if he had a fond memory of each. Then he started to pull books off the shelf and pass them to me, one after the other after the other. The stack got heavy in my arms, and as I looked at the titles, I wasn't exactly sure why I was holding them unless I wanted to learn all about art history, which I didn't. Ancient Roman, Ancient Greek, Renaissance, Da Vinci, Monet, not a single book on how to draw. Nothing like that. Grandfather stopped and looked at me, then he said, "Good," and turned toward the stairs. "Grandpa, this is swell and all, but I don't really want to be an artist. I just want to learn how to draw the cartoons." I said it all, knowing he probably didn't understand. "History, good," he replied. "History, good." By the time we made it home, I was a sweaty mess, but Grandpa was just starting. He sat at the kitchen table and looked at me. "Paper," he said, so I grabbed the paper and pen and ink from our room and brought them to him. He pushed over a thick, small book with the History of Art written on the cover. I opened it, and the writing was small and densely packed into each page. It looked impossible to read. I was bored just flipping the pages. "Read and practice. Today, circle." He reached over to one of the larger, glossier books and opened it. He found a page with a glossy photo of a painting. A woman sat, looking kind of depressed, holding on to a puppy in her lap. My grandfather looked at me and pointed at the painting. Then he started to recreate the painting on the page with circles, and ovals, and other geometric shapes. She had no facial features, hands, or anything. It was almost like she was a shadow of herself. "You see?" he said.
"Ah, circles,"
said Ma, looking over my shoulder. I looked up at her.
"Starting with the basics."
I nodded. "Water?" she asked. I nodded again. As she went to the sink, she said, "You know, I always said that you'd inherited your artistic ability from your grandfather." "To who?" I asked, watching my grandfather draw. "To everyone," she replied, placing 2 cloudy glasses of water on the table. "Not to me," I said. "I don't remember you saying much about him ever." "I did," she replied. "Maybe you don't remember." "You didn't." I was feeling annoyed again, reminded of how she had just invited this stranger to stay with us without even talking to me about it, without even warning me about it. I heard a sigh. "I'm going to buy groceries for dinner." She turned on her heel and left. "Buddy," said my grandfather, and I looked back then, shocked. I'd never heard him say my name before. "Okay, work now." He passed me some paper and pushed over the book, flipping to another page. It was strange seeing these colorful paintings in black and white. They felt like only half the story. "Work." He passed me the pen and looked at my page closely. I finally nodded. "Circles?" I said. "Yes, circles."